Welcome to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. The barrage of scaremongering by the British press before the Football World Cup painted the hosts, Russia, as a tyrannical country unsafe for tourists and football fans alike. But the reality, well, it's been very different. Visitors have taken to social media to explain that they've found Russia and her people hospitable and friendly. This wasn't what they were told to expect. So, was this media onslaught just a mistake? Or was this the latest instalment of post-Cold War rhetoric designed to malign Russia? With relations between the West and Russia at an all-time low, where next for this relationship? Joining me to discuss why both sides are locked in this frozen conflict is the writer and broadcaster John Wight. John, welcome. Why are we here? Why do we have this rhetoric persistently given about Russia and the demonisation of it? And why are we at such a low ebb between both the West and Russia?
It's really very simple. It's because of the refusal of the West and Western elites to let go of the old reality of hegemony and accept and recognise the new reality of multipolarity. And this has been driving this bent towards Russia because Russia dares to assert its right to have an independent foreign policy. It dares to assert the right to have its own legitimate security interests, which it is willing and able to defend autonomously, as it has done in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine since 2014. And it really stems from the conclusions that were drawn from the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, the disastrous conclusions that were drawn in Washington, which was that not that the Cold War ended mutually between Gorbachev, the last premier of the Soviet Union, and George H.W. Bush, who was then US president, to their mutual advantage, but that the US won that war and that Russia was and is a vanquished power. And so triumphalism reigned in Washington as a result of that. They thought it was the end of history, per Francis Fukuyama's infamous boast that liberal democracy had proved itself to be the one, the only socio-economic and political system that's coterminous with civilization and human progress. And that has run right through the corridors of power in the US and to the same extent in the corridors of power of its Western allies.
Is what you're saying that because of that triumphalism and because they have thought that actually there's vanquishing of Russia, there's a sense of surprise that Russia's now back and therefore it needs dealing with?
Surprise and also indignation. How dare you recover? How dare you think you're on the same level as we are? And where it's led to is a mentality of Catargo delenda est. Russia must be destroyed. It's Rome versus Carthage. And the very fact that Russia exists for these people, these neocons and liberal interventionists, is a dagger pointed at the heart of the US. And don't forget, there's a massive machine behind this politics and behind this ideology, the network of think tanks, foundations, the arms industry, a vast machine, a vast amount of money is being made out of this. And there's a lot at stake for these people. And so this is driving it. And the fact that they're unable to bring Russia to heel and that Russia refuses to know its place is really bringing us to the brink of catastrophe. In fact, it has brought us to the brink of catastrophe. We had the US missile strike on the basis of the alleged chemical weapons attack carried out by the Syrian government in Douma and Eastern Ghouta in April. That's the closest we've ever come to World War III. It was chilling, and I really thought we were very, very close. And credit must go to the Russian government because it was willing to allow itself to be humiliated and back off and not retaliate and not draw a red line, which it certainly would have had every right to do. So it's a very, very dangerous time. And you know this, we've just commemorated the 55th anniversary of JFK's famous peace speech.
What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
This is a conclusion that he drew after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, along with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, his Soviet counterpart at that time, that we can never let things get this close again. But JFK was a man of real standing, of intellectual heft, of a moral centre. There's nothing like it in Washington today. Nothing like it within the corridors of power. Nothing like it within the White House. And because of that lack of quality, that lack of human quality within the Western leadership circles is a very, very dangerous time. More dangerous at any time since the history, in fact, including the history of the Cold War. This is worse than it's ever been. We need to get back to the principles that were set out in the UN Charter.
Right, what are they?
We're offering respect for international law, respect for national sovereignty, and respect for self-determination. And those have been abstracted in service to this neo-conservative and liberal interventionist. And the thing about this hegemony, this drive for hegemony in our time, is it's rooted in exceptionalism. And this is a very virulent species of nationalism.
What does that mean? Explain
that we are an exceptional nation. We are the one indispensable nation. This is the refrain. This is the indoctrination that goes on within the US. This dominates the dominant cultural values, that we are the exceptional nation, the one indispensable nation. And this is what drives them to believe that no country has the right, the moral right, or the civilizational right to stand up to the US and what it represents. The lack of ability to transcend that is what's given us the present crisis.
The events of the Cold War are overwhelmingly US attacks on movements of independence in its own domains on the pretext that the Russians are coming, and Russian actions against its own satellites on the pretext that the Americans are coming. There's almost a tacit compact in which each power, the huge superpower and the minor one, use the pretext of the other to control their own domains. And it's striking that when the Cold War ended, if you take a look at U.S. policy, it's the first thing you look at if you try to figure out what the Cold War was about. George Bush, that first was president, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they announced a new national security strategy, a defense budget, and so on, which were very revealing. And what they said is everything is going to remain the same except for pretexts. So we still need a huge military system, but not because the Russians are coming, because they're not. Because of the technological sophistication of third world powers. They said that and hoped people wouldn't laugh. We're right. They said we still have to sustain the defense industrial base. That's the standard euphemism for high-tech industry. So we have to make sure that the rich can be supported by the nanny state. And crucially, they said we have to maintain intervention forces directed at the Middle East. And then comes a nice phrase, where the serious threats to our interests could not be laid at the Kremlin's door. So in other words, sorry folks, we've been lying to you for 50 years, but now clouds have lifted. So we have to say, yeah, we have to prevent what's called radical nationalism, meaning independence. So nothing changed, except pretexts, and of course tactics are modified. And if you look closely, that's what you find.
You mentioned a multipolar world. Is there a sort of moment, or how do multipolar worlds come about?
The unofficial declaration of the new multipolar world was given by Vladimir Putin.
When?
During his address to the United Nations, the 70th General Assembly of the United Nations in 2015, September the 28th. It was less an address and more of a rap sheet that he delivered to the assembled delegates for the benefit of the world, but directed at Western powers, articulating all the disasters that they've been involved in pursuit of hegemony or in pursuit of the unipolarity that they had enjoyed up to that point after the demise of the Soviet Union, about the disaster of Iraq, disaster of Libya, what was going on in Syria, and only creating this phenomenon of international terrorism that was a threat to their people and the Russian people.
Problems have been piling up in this region for a long time. The people there wanted changes, naturally. But how did it actually turn out? Rather than bringing about reforms, aggressive foreign interference has resulted in the destruction of national institutions and the lifestyle itself. Instead of democracy and progress, we have violence, poverty, and social disaster. But nobody cares a bit about human rights, including the right to life. I can't help asking those who've caused this situation, Do you realise now what you've done?
We're living in not an anti-Western world, but a post-West world. We've transcended the unipolarity led by Washington.
And that multipolarity is here to stay.
It's here to stay.
When you talk about post-Duma or pre-Duma, apparently Mr. Assad using chemicals on his own people, not once during any of the articles I read were the two words international law mentioned in the British press.
Yeah.
If we're going to take the UN seriously, why are we so short-sighted as not to refer back to those principles that they've set out?
Well, it used to be said that we had an establishment with its own media. I think it's quite arguable now that we have an establishment media with its own political class, because in many ways they are setting the tone. If you consider after the Skripal poisoning, from the very moment that crime took place, the right-wing press, the establishment press in the UK, the right-wing and liberal press was asserting blame at Russia's door. It was Russia. And then Theresa May was bounced, I think, to making that statement in the Parliament, given that she's mired in a Brexit crisis, that she cannot afford to look any weaker than she already is.
Who bounced her?
The media. Rupert Murdoch's press, the media, the Barclay brothers. They are running the show. They wield such a disproportionate and malign influence on our democracy and on our political class. And so this was the trajectory of the Skripal case and where we are now with that. That without any evidence, without any investigation, it was Russia. We have a very poisonous and toxic media when it comes to representing so-called Western values, which is really their values, the values that they're indoctrinated with and inculcated with at Eton and Harrow and Oxford, which I maintain are our madrasas. These institutions are hotbeds of extremism.
Why? Explain that, because people will hear that and say, hang on, you can't compare a madrasa in Pakistan.
Oh yes, you can. It's actually worse, given the damage that we've done around the world compared to what's come out of those madrasas in Pakistan. These are the places where succeeding generations of the ruling class are inculcated with this right to rule, born to rule ethos, which has wrought so much damage around the world. Tony Blair went to Fettes, an elite school where he spent his formative educational years.
In Edinburgh.
This is where it starts, in Edinburgh. This is where it starts. I walk past it every single day. And I look at it and I think of all the crimes that have issued from that building. Same with Oxbridge.
But I just clarify, because we need to be careful on this point of crimes. When you say these crimes that have come from these organisations, which crimes?
Iraq, Afghanistan, going back to the 1980s, not post 9/11. Libya, what they've been doing in Syria, trying to undermine a secular government that represents a non-sectarian society in which minority communities can trace their existence back a millennium and more, on the side, on a de facto basis at least, perhaps even directly, of extremist head-chopping fanatics. There's no other way to describe them. Coterminous with what took place in Cambodia in the 1970s, in similar conditions of chaos, which were then created again by the West, the US bombing of Cambodia, in service to the Vietnam War and in service to the Cold War nostrums that obtained then. So there is a pattern that runs right through our history, certainly since the Second World War, of blundering around like an out-of-control juggernaut, not on the basis of international law, not on the basis of any moral principle. The only principle is domination and hegemony. 800 military bases in over 70 countries around the world. Do you think they're there to make the world safe for democracy? Well, only if you believe anything they tell you. They're there to make the world safe for the ability of Western global corporations to rampage around the planet with unfettered, exploiting the world's human and natural resources. And the economic roots of this are actually important, because neoliberalism is an economic model which is no respecter of borders, no respecter of sovereignty, no respecter of culture. It's a world market, and that market is being fashioned in the image of America.
Are you saying that the neoliberal agenda ultimately stops at nothing to achieve its goals, and within that striving, there's criminal activity?
It has to. Well, I'm being very subjective with crime. Well, I think Iraq was, most people around the world consider that to have been a crime, given the events that led up to that, the faulty intelligence and so forth. Me, in terms of my ideological prism, these are crimes. These are crimes committed by rich countries against poor countries for no other reason than wealth from rich, for material gain, and to cement this ideology of domination, imperialism. It's imperialism in red and tooth and claw. Of course, there's a massive amount of embroidery that goes to try and mystify the process, you know, democracy and human rights and all these humanitarian intervention and right to protect, but it's imperialism. It was imperialism in the 19th century and it's imperialism in the 21st century.
Welcome back to Renegade Inc, the show that allows us to think differently. Before we talk more about the new low in the relationship between Russia and the West with John Wight, let's have a look at what you've been tweeting about in this week's Renegade Inc. Index. First up, from James Rogers. I first went to the USSR as a student in 1987, as a journalist in 1991. I lived in Moscow for many years. I cannot remember a time when relations between UK and Russia were so bad, but good to see recognition of our country's shared history. World Cup, Russia 2018. Well, one of the interesting things here, John, is that people have gone to the World Cup and they've heard so much negative press, and they've been pleasantly surprised because it's been an absolute shock. Turns out Russia is nothing like it's depicted in the press.
There was a concerted campaign to try and subvert that World Cup before it began. Talks about boycotts, Boris Johnson, British Foreign Secretary's outrageous statement comparing the World Cup in Russia to the Olympic Games in Germany in 1936. Hitler's Games, the Nazi Games. It really has been revelatory, the extent to which the veil has been lifted, and this is to the great discredit of these liberal propagandists. I describe them, they're not genuine journalists, they're ideologically driven foot soldiers on the side of an establishment seething with anti-Russia sentiment.
Next tweet is from Neil Clark. Neocon loses it big time after BBC's Dan Walker speaks positively about Russia's hosting of the World Cup. These people can't give it a break.
Well, people like Mr. Montgomery see themselves as gatekeepers. They are the ones who dictate how people are to view Russia. And if anyone deviates, and certainly anyone within the media, such as Dan Walker did, and his praise for Russia's hosting of the World Cup and the organisation and so forth, then the forces of hell will be unleashed. And that's what Neil Clark is referring to with that tweet.
And finally, from Kel Sorensen, is Europe too brainwashed to normalise relations with Russia? Perhaps war would be less of a threat if Russia simply disengaged from the West and focused on integration with the East. Sooner or later, Europe would come courting. And that from Paul Craig Roberts.
This gets to the heart of the matter because what we're talking about is the catastrophic handling of relations between the West and Russia after the demise of the Soviet Union and after that dark period of the 1990s where the Russian people were subjected to a free market experiment in human despair, for that is what it was. Russia experienced something that was many times worse than the Great Depression in that decade. People have to understand, in 1989, in what is now the Russian Federation, 2 million people were living in poverty. By 1999, or 1998, that figure had gone up to 70 million. That's a verifiable fact. The country was on the edge of an abyss, and that has fed Russia's understanding of the West's and its understanding of what a subaltern status would look like. It would forever be forced to pay the price, according to Western elites, of the Soviet Union's existence, purely because the Soviet Union represented an alternative social and economic model which threatened their social and economic model. Vladimir Putin, when he came to power in 2000, he went out of his way to try and foment positive relations with the West. It is a matter of historical record that he even muted the possibility with Bill Clinton in 2000 of Russia joining NATO. He also went out of his way to help the United States after 9/11.
So who is the barrier to progress? If Putin, as you say, has gone out there and tried to become part of NATO, tried to build bridges, do all this diplomacy, provide this infrastructure, where's the barrier to progress in all this? What's stopping this happening? Why isn't this partnership thriving and blossoming?
Ideology. The indoctrination with this born-to-rule ethos, this Western exceptionalism, this focus on liberal democracy as the only game in town when it comes to running the world's affairs. They want to reshape the world or fashion the world in their own image, but they by and large have. It's an interesting phenomenon and dynamic which I think help you explain how this works in reality. Donald Trump came on the scene in 2016. He carried none of the ideological baggage. He had no prior political experience. He was a swashbuckling businessman, or certainly he liked to present himself as one. I have no candle for Donald Trump, don't get me wrong. But when he started talking about resetting relations with Russia, about moving away from confrontation, about accepting Russia as a partner in the fight against ISIS or Daesh, and trying to roll back from foreign policy adventures, from war in the Middle East, from this overarching huge commitment of US military power around the world, US subsidization of NATO and so on and so forth. There was a cri de coeur issued in Washington amongst all these liberal interventionists and neocons. And this is, I think, what's been feeding this Robert Mueller investigation to try and bring them back into line.
That was going to be my next point, my next question, the Trump the Donald. The interesting aspect of what you've just said there is no prior political history or knowledge, really. So if you come back to your Oxbridge theory or Ivy League theory, he hasn't been, in a sense, inculcated in that way.
Donald Trump didn't come with any of that kind of baggage, any of that ideological drivers. He wanted to sort out a mess that he felt had been left behind by his predecessors. A businessman, he wanted to make deals, he wanted to sort problems out. He sees himself as a problem solver, whether you think he's good at that or not, that's another discussion. And I think he brought that to the table, and he realised quickly that he was not going to be allowed to, because his administration, regardless of what you think of him, and I think he's an awful man in many ways, but his administration was placed under a veritable siege in the interests of an alliance against international global terrorism. He got rid of Steve Bannon for different reasons, and he's had to bring in John Bolton, McMaster, Mike Pompeo. Right. You know, these are part of the machine. They're part of the machine.
Where do you see all this ending?
Well, I'm a great believer in referencing history to give us an understanding of where we are today, and I see many parallels between the dying days of the Roman Empire. We're talking about a US empire that shares many of the same qualities as the Roman Empire. People going out of their way to try and live there and get citizenship, controls the world with its huge military, presents itself as a model of civilization, and that any other rival state or bloc or power has to be destroyed because two things can't occupy the same space at the same time. Where I see it ending is how China and Russia manage that decline. This is their priority, and I think the Russian and Chinese governments understand that priority.
And have they got a leadership role now? Because actually what you're saying is this empire that's out of control, it's in its death throes, it doesn't really know what it's doing. Yeah. And because one of the facets of a dying empire is an undisciplined, out of control military.
Well, this is what we're seeing. Well, we're seeing it's being wielded in a very uncontrolled, ill-disciplined way around the world in these disastrous wars, one after the other. They're only deepening instability, not restoring stability.
So you're saying that other actors, namely China, Russia...
Yes, they have a massive role. They have a massive role to play. Let me make clear, when I say it's in decline, I don't mean it's in decline like in a decade. I'm talking many, many, many years, but the trajectory is there. And I think this is why there's an overemphasis now being placed on military power, on hard power. And diplomacy is being taken off the table as a way, increasingly in Washington, as a way to deal with international affairs or international issues or conflicts. And it's almost like diplomacy is considered to be for wimps. And this gets to the heart of the national myths which sustains America. This rugged individualist power that fears no one and that will protect its interests in a way that no one else can, this muscular idea of itself on the world stage. And this is reflected in the polarisation of US society. The plethora of gun crimes, mass shootings, police violence.
I was going to say, they do have a huge amount of internal problems.
Massive. And this is fed by, and this feeds, in turn, foreign policy and America's engagement with the world. It's a circular relationship. A foreign policy that is driven by imperialism rests on foundations of social and economic justice at home. And that's what we're seeing. Malcolm X came out with a quote which I put great store by. He said, "You can't understand what's going on in Mississippi if you don't understand what's going on in the Congo." And I think that translates to today. You can't understand what's going on in Watts or what's going on in South Central LA or what's going on in Charlottesville if you don't understand what's going on in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq.
Just expand on that.
Well, there's a circular relationship between foreign policy and domestic policy. One feeds the other because it's based on the same ideology of domination and huge violence being unleashed against the poor at home and against the poor overseas or poor country overseas. There's a hatred of the other. Racism, white supremacy. White supremacy not only as a racial construct, but also as an ideological construct. Barack Obama was a white supremacist. That might sound controversial to people watching this, but he served a machine that rests on foundations of white supremacy. If anyone works for the government in the States or works for its federal government or works for the police, they are serving the interests of white supremacy, whether they're conscious of it or not. Ignorance is increasingly a choice in our world. We're blessed with a plethora of media now that we didn't have even 15 years ago.
But that's a very hopeful situation, isn't it?
It's a very hopeful situation. Information is power. This foreign policy requires is public support. And if the public support's not there, they're limited in what they can do. Or let me put it more honestly, they're limited in the damage that they can do. And so if we had RT, if we had Al Jazeera, well, Al Jazeera came on stream around the time of Iraq, but if we had TRT World, if we had France, if we had the plethora of international, if we had the Latin American channel, Telesur, if we had all these different multiple international media platforms that were accessible to the general public, it would have been far more difficult for Tony Blair and George W. Bush to make the case for the war in Iraq. Far more difficult. Even though they may still have ignored it, given there was 2 million people on the streets of London on February 15th, 2003. But certainly it would have been much more difficult, I think, for them to make a convincing argument, because then they still control the news narrative by and large in a way that they do not now. hence the demonisation of RT, hence the demonisation of Russian media, because they see Russian media as a threat on the level of ideas and news information to that narrative, which is required in order to try and shape public consensus about who our official enemies are.
So in an emerging multipolar world, the public, the people watching this, have got a duty of care. Graze not just on the domestic media, get your news sources from different places, and also, when you have that knowledge, hold your elected officials to account.
Absolutely, that's how it works. We still do live in a democracy, albeit a very truncated one in my view, but that democracy gives us space to make those arguments and to make our voices heard and to change direction, and we should use that opportunity because all our futures and the future of our children really do depend on it.
John Wight, thank you for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. HQ this week. You can drop the team a mail, studio@renegadeinc.com, or you can tweet us at Renegade Inc. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.